Welcome to Shooting Straight, WayOneF.com. I'm Frank Miniature, the editor-in-chief. The editor is America's First Freedom. Today, here we are again with Charles Cooke, who, if you read America's First Freedom, you sure are familiar with Charles's writing. He also writes a lot for National Review. And Charles, I've seen you on Tucker Carlson and places, so you're out there talking about a lot of things. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is that you are a Floridian now. I realize you're British and you're from Britain, but you are now, and for some time, living in Florida, where your governor just gave you constitutional carry. So I'm wondering about all the Wild West shootouts that, well, they must be going on now. That's what they tell us on the gun control side. It just must be happening all over Florida.
Yeah, it was instant. The second he signed the bill, people started behaving irrationally, as they have in the 25 other states that had it before Florida. As we've all seen, right? The last 20 years. Silly.
Yeah, I've asked a lot of governors that question. After they pass constitutional carry, what's going on in your streets? Has the crime gone crazy? What's happening? And they all just kind of laugh. No, things have been peaceful and they've been great, and the law-abiding are not the problem, which is what somebody who's carrying legally is. Just because the government bureaucrat's not in your way of this freedom doesn't make anything less dangerous. In fact, it makes it more safe. What the last study from Georgetown showed that 1.6 million people per year, Americans per year, defend themselves in some way with a firearm, mostly without firing a shot. I mean, these are safe, law-abiding people that want to protect themselves. So I imagine that's what's happening in Florida.
Yeah, so the two statistics that I saw while I was writing the most recent piece on this that I did for you, that I thought really underscored just how little constitutional carry matters to crime, at least in terms of making it worse. First, that the legislature of Florida passed this in both houses with so many votes that if Governor DeSantis, for whatever reason, had said, I'm not going to sign it, it would still have become law. This passed in Florida with veto-proof majorities in both houses of the state legislature. That was the first one. That shows you something. The second one was actually discovered by John Lott, and that is that although 24 states, and now 25 with Florida, have passed constitutional carry legislatively, Vermont is the outlier. It had a constitutional provision that in 1903 was interpreted to mandate constitutional carry. Although 24, now 25 states with Florida have done this legislatively, not one of them has ever held a vote to repeal the law, and not one of them has even held a hearing on this issue. So not even a grandstanding hearing. No one scheduled this so that they could talk about all of the supposed ills of constitutional carry. And the reason for that is that there aren't any. This is a bureaucratic change. This has no effect on the real world other than to make it easier for law-abiding people, the people that we don't worry about in the first place, to carry. This doesn't change anything concrete. It doesn't allow criminals to carry guns legally. It doesn't change which guns can be carried. It doesn't change where those guns can be carried or under what circumstances. All it does is it stops the people you don't worry about in the first place from having to ask the government for permission. I mean, the idea that asking people to obtain a small piece of plastic is going to prevent those who are willing to violate much worse laws from committing crimes is really ridiculous on its face. It's the equivalent of believing that if you put up a sign that says gun-free zone, the sort of people who want to harm others are going to look at it and say, oh, well, I guess I'd better not go in there then. And, historically, this stuff has actually been somewhat sinister. There are all sorts of good reasons to get rid of permits now, absent America's history. For example, if you are a woman who has an abusive boyfriend or a stalker, you really don't want to wait 2 or 3 months while the state discovers that you are, in fact, the law-abiding citizen that you say you are. If you're poorer or you work all the time, you don't want to have to pay or take time off work to exercise a constitutional right. These are all good reasons. Another good reason, especially in the South, is that these systems were set up to deliberately exclude certain Americans from exercising their constitutional rights. If you go back to the origin of permitting systems, they're not really that different than the origin of other sort of poll taxes or tests that were put in the way of newly freed slaves. If you go back to the immediate post-Civil War period, you'll find the Reconstruction era Republicans doing everything they can to ensure that African Americans are treated as full citizens. The Freedmen's Bureau Act is passed in 1866, the Civil Rights Act in 1866, the 14th Amendment. And of course, it didn't work because there was so much power in the southern states that laws were passed to subtly remove the rights that had been won. Well, those laws have been repealed. They've been repealed in Florida most recently. They've been repealed in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. They're probably going to be repealed in North Carolina and Louisiana fairly soon. That is a good thing. We've got rid of these vestiges of Jim Crow and made sure that people who have historically been denied their rights can't be in the future by putting these questions into the hand of bureaucrats.
Right, if you really are for women's rights, for our minorities, for the disenfranchised in our society, especially the poor, then you should be for the Second Amendment, for that freedom, that right to defend themselves. And too often in our population, that's historically happening, especially in the South.
That's right. And another practical reason that is more modern in its application is just that if you put the government in between you and your rights, even if you like the people who run the government, even if you vote in people who say they will uphold your rights, even if you have, as Florida did, a shall issue system that is pretty good relative to much of the rest of the country when it was passed, 1987, Florida becomes one of the first big states to do shall issue. Even if you have all of that, you still are at the whim of the government. Now, during COVID, when in the early days, when nobody quite knew how bad the virus was, and many government agencies, like big corporations, sent people home and said work from home, the Florida Department of Agriculture put the processing of new concealed carry permits on hold. And it ended up being on hold for months. Now, if you held a concealed carry permit that was expiring during that time, the state did extend it. But if you were a new applicant, you couldn't get one. Whatever you did, however law-abiding you were, however compliant you were, you could not get one. I think I'm right in saying the office was closed for 3 months in total. Now, again, if you discover during that period, during an emergency, the point at which you actually need your rights more than ever, if you discover during that period that your life is in danger, if you have a stalker, if somebody is threatening you, if crime goes up in your area, you really have two choices. One is to wait for the government to come back into its office and grant you a right that you should not have to ask for in the first place, and the other is to break the law. And what Florida did by repealing its permitting process, like 24 other states before it, and Vermont in 1903, is say, no, we are not going to make you make that decision without us.
Exactly. So here we have Florida, the 26th state. Likely Nebraska, as we speak, will be the 27th state. Do you see this continuing? What's the process here? Are we reaching the limit, reaching the cap, you think? Because there are certain states that seem less likely to pass constitutional carry and get bureaucrats out of the way of our freedom.
And I think it will keep going. I do think at a certain point it will stop. I don't think we'll get to 50. I mean, as you say, Nebraska's about to do it. The legislature in Louisiana would do it. They have Democratic Governor Bell Edwards, who is, for a Democrat at the moment, pretty good on guns, but I don't know if he would sign a constitutional carry bill. So he's probably the impediment there. North Carolina's considering this. They now have a supermajority of Republican legislators, so it depends what that makeup looks like. There are a lot of states. It surprises people when you tell them which states have permitless carry. They always assume that it's Mississippi and South Dakota, which it is. But it's also Maine and New Hampshire and Ohio. There are many states that have done this precisely because it's not a problem. So I could see us getting to maybe 37, 38, but we'd have to see political sea changes in California and New York and New Jersey and Illinois to get them on board. But it does matter, Frank, I think, that we can now say, the outliers are a handful of states. It's not the case anymore, oh, this is this crazy thing. I never believed this for a second. I was always in favor of permitless carry. But as a conservative dispositionally, I sort of understood in 2002 when people said, okay, I don't know what I think about that. If you're on the fence, if you're a moderate, if you're not sure, and Alaska or Arizona say they're going to do permitless carry, I can understand you saying that's a bit new. Well, it's not new now. It's been 20 years. 26 states have it. We know that it doesn't do anything bad, and in fact, it's good. There is no reason to stay against this. And so I think it's good that we are able to say, look, it doesn't make a difference in the way that you're worried that it will make a difference. You should do it. And by the way, you're now in the minority when we're talking to California or New York or New Jersey.
What astounds me as I look at this thing is this elephant in the room, crime. You would think that if these gun control supporting politicians and groups really wanted to lessen gun ownership in the United States of America, you'd think they would fight crime instead of putting in these woke prosecutors and these bail reform policies, letting criminals right back out onto the streets, and blaming law-abiding citizens for the actions of this small, violent minority of criminals who are out there. You'd think they would go after those criminals and make our streets safer, because a lot of these new people that I talk to who are buying firearms for the first time are buying it because they're insecure in this rising crime.
Well, exactly. And this is the great paradox of gun control in the United States now, is that if you ask me, should we impose stricter gun control, I will say no on the front end. I don't want more gun control laws. We have a lot of them. I don't think we need any more. If you ask the DA in New York, should we have more gun control laws, he'll say yeah. If you ask him if he wants to prosecute them, he'll say no. In other words, the gun control laws that he wants only apply to the people who aren't a problem. If you're going to have gun control laws that are not enforced against criminals, then you may as well not have the gun control laws in the first place. And that's the paradox that we've seen at the moment, is that states such as New York and New Jersey and California, and in some cases Pennsylvania, especially in Philadelphia, they have these laws that they keep piling up. And the only people who are following them are the people that we don't need to worry about. Concealed carriers, data out of Florida and Texas shows, are 6 or 7 times more law-abiding than the police. When you impose rules on them, you are saying that we are going to damage the solution. And when you refuse to enforce the laws that we have, some of which are good, I don't have a problem with preventing people who have been convicted of serious felonies from owning or carrying firearms. When you don't impose those, though, you're giving those people carte blanche. So, of course, people are going out and saying, I'm going to buy a gun. Because they know that to the extent that the government is interested in this problem, it's interested in them and not the people that are a threat.
Right. If you live in a constitutional carry state, you want to go buy a firearm, you go to a federally licensed firearm dealer, you still have to go through the NICS background check through the FBI. Right. You still have to have your name run through it and so on to make sure that you're not prohibited from owning that firearm before you can obtain that firearm. But a criminal, as we've looked at the studies, we notice that most of the criminals are getting their guns illegally in one way or another, stealing them, straw purchases, and other means, and then they're going about and doing their crimes. They're not getting them lawfully the way the average citizen is doing. So going after the average armed citizen, the good person, how, statistically, any which way you look at it, how does this dampen crime? How does it reduce crime? How does it help anybody?
Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, the other one that we hear increasingly, and in fact, this was what Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, said on the day that DeSantis signed Florida's constitutional carry bill. She said, so soon after a mass shooting in Tennessee. This is a ridiculous non sequitur, and it should be called out at every stage. What happened in Tennessee was an atrocity. But it was not an atrocity that was carried out by a member of the National Rifle Association or a writer at National Review. This was an atrocity that was carried out by someone who had no regard for human life. All of the laws that person broke in doing what she did were extremely serious, far more serious under the law than any of the ones that surround concealed carry. Now, what she did had nothing to do with concealed carry. It didn't even intersect with concealed carry. How could it have? There was nothing that would have been different about what she did, whether the state had concealed carry or not had concealed carry, whether the state had constitutional carry or not constitutional carry, whether she had a concealed carry permit or not. It didn't intersect as a fact pattern. But this was a person who was willing to break the law that dictates that you cannot take guns into schools, and then was willing to murder people, children no less. This is a person who murdered children. Do we really believe that they are going to be stopped by a slight change in the bureaucratic process by which someone is permitted to carry a firearm? I mean, are we crazy?
Well, that person also looked at targets to attack and picked what that person saw. I don't know whether to call it a soft target, as a gun-free zone. And okay, I look at that, and that's often what these people do. They look for a place where the armed resistance is going to be less. If even non-existent, because they want to kill as many people as possible and become famous in that process. So then I wonder about the people in that school, and I think, is there one single person who was in that school and this person did the evil thing they did, who didn't want a good person in that school to have a firearm, to be carrying lawfully concealed, to be able to take on that person even faster than those heroic cops were able to do?
Right, and again, what would the downside have been if there had been someone in that school, a good person, with a gun? It is just impossible to establish. You know, in the case of the shooting at Pulse in 2006, which fits the pattern you mentioned as well, because that guy looked around for potential targets and decided against others because they were well protected. In the case of that shooting, Bill Clinton said after the fact that it was a good thing that no one inside the club had been armed, because then things could have got really dangerous. I mean, This is a ridiculous, preposterous way of looking at the world. You do not have to worry about law-abiding people with firearms. You only have to worry about the people who have evil in their hearts. It would have been very good if people in that club had had firearms and had been able to fight back, as it would have been in Nashville. And I think this is the key point. Permitless carry not only enforces a constitutional right, which is extremely important in and of itself, but it acknowledges that it just doesn't matter how many laws you pile up, because the people who don't want to follow them are not going to follow them, and the people who will follow them don't need them in the first place. That is not true in all of society. There are many good reasons that we have laws, but the permitting systems that we now have still in 24 states, they are what you would call malum prohibitum laws. There's this distinction in law that goes back to the Romans. Malum prohibitum is a law that is illegal because it's illegal. Malum in se is a law that's illegal because everyone just instinctively, intrinsically, innately understands that it should be illegal. A murder law is a malum in se law. We don't need to explain to people why it's there. But a malum prohibitum law, if you take an office in this part of town, then your gate cannot be more than 7 inches raised above the floor on a concrete founding. That's a malum prohibitum sort of law. It doesn't really matter. When you get prosecuted under it, you get prosecuted because it's there. This is what the permitting system is for firearms. There's no good reason for it. There's no great argument for it. It's just that if you break it, you are in trouble because it is there. And 26 states have realized this. Over time, they have realized that this is a pointless obstacle that is in the way, and they've got rid of it, and I hope more follow suit.
It's amazing, Charlie. We've been sitting here talking. This is common sense conversation. I think most people would follow it and agree with it, maybe add a point or two here and there with their own opinions and so on. But this is common sense stuff that just doesn't go on in the mainstream media. It doesn't go on with the politicians who back this kind of gun control laws. They want to suspend common sense and just place their control over society. And it's failing because the American people are awake. The National Rifle Association is out there and strong, and people are awake. People are listening, and they're thinking, and they're getting it.
Yeah, and I think they see through it as well. I think they understand that the vast majority of the arguments that are made against permitless carry are actually not made against permitless carry. They're made against gun ownership. I mean, that's why there is such an opposition to this, is that this, in their minds of those who object to it, gets them further away from their ultimate goal, which is to repeal the Second Amendment and severely limit private gun ownership, if not abolish it outright. The arguments that are made against permitless carry don't really have anything to do with permitless carry. I think I pointed this out in the piece that I wrote for you on this. That the most famous MSNBC segment on this from the debate over Florida's law consisted of people saying that this would allow anyone to carry a gun anywhere, which is not true. That's just not what the law does. It doesn't allow anyone. The same people are prohibited as were before. It doesn't have anything to do with where and when guns can be carried. It just says that if you're on the allowed list, you don't need a piece of paper to prove it. Well, why do they say that? Part of it's ignorance. Part of it is because what they really want to get rid of is the number of Americans, a growing number of Americans of all races, male and female, in various parts of the country, who are owning firearms. But they don't want to say that out loud because they know that that is a very unpopular proposition. So instead they pretend that they're against this particular change, which really, if anyone thinks about it, there's no reason to be against.
Well, again, if they really wanted to do that, they should fight crime. that would convince those people that are on the border whether they want to buy a firearm self-defense or not. Possibly some of them would not. We wouldn't have had this huge growth in gun ownership we've had since 2020 otherwise if they were fighting crime. So, Charlie, where can people find you, follow you?
Well, I write at National Review, so if you put my name in on there. I have a weekly newsletter, which you can find at my website, charlescwcooke.com, and I'm on Twitter at Charles C.W. Cooke. I have a podcast. If you Google my name, Charles C.W. Cooke, you'll find it all.
And you do a lot for America's First Freedom, which everyone can find at a1f.com. Thank you, Charlie.